Hey strangers, thanks for stopping by and spending your time with us. Before we start, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy it, don't forget to subscribe. It means a lot. Now, let's begin.
Section 1. The Quiet Intake. I arrived at the research center on a Tuesday morning, carrying my usual bag and a coffee I hadn't finished. From the outside, the building looked like any office block. Clean windows, a line of parked cars, people moving in and out quietly. There were no flashy signs, just a small plaque that read, Center for Cognitive and Perceptual Studies. Ordinary, predictable, perfectly unremarkable. Inside, the reception was calm. A woman behind the desk smiled and asked for my name. She had that neutral, professional smile that's both polite and effortless. I signed a few papers, confirming my participation in the day's study. The clipboard felt familiar, almost mundane, but a tiny flutter of anticipation tickled my stomach. Soon, a researcher came to escort me. He was mid-30s, dressed neatly, and spoke in a quiet, even voice. "Good morning," he said. "We'll just run through today's session. You'll be alone in the testing room for a period, but nothing will harm you. The rest is very routine." Routine. That word made the knot in my stomach relax slightly. I nodded. He led me down a hallway lined with doors and glass panels, past offices with people working at computers, talking softly on phones, or moving quietly between rooms. A normal office, really. I tried to imagine this day like any other, mundane, professional, nothing out of the ordinary. Finally, we reached the room. The door was heavy, gray, with a small window showing the empty interior. "This is the testing room," he said. "It's soundproofed. You'll spend time inside alone. Just notice your experience. Move however you like. There's no right or wrong way to feel." I stepped inside. At first glance, it looked like a small office. A chair in the center, a low table against a wall, soft carpet, neutral walls. The lighting was gentle, soft enough to avoid glare, but bright enough to read. It smelled faintly of linen, clean and neutral. I sat down. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not just a lack of noise, but a kind of complete stillness. No air conditioning hum, no distant chatter. Just a calm absence of sound. It was so ordinary, so unassuming, that it almost felt alive. I focused on my own presence in the room, my breathing, my heartbeat, the slight shift of my weight. Every small sensation felt amplified, like the room had subtly adjusted itself to make me notice myself. Through the intercom, the researcher spoke once more. "Whenever you're ready, we'll begin. Remember, this is routine. Nothing will harm you. Just notice what you notice." The click of the intercom felt like the final seal on the ordinary, professional, unremarkable nature of the experiment. And yet, as I sat there, alone, a small, unplaceable feeling tickled the back of my mind. The room seemed calm, normal, neutral, but somehow it also felt aware. At first, I cataloged my surroundings like I always did in unfamiliar spaces. The texture of the carpet, the angles of the walls, the shape of the chair. Everything was ordinary. Everything was calm. And yet the calmness itself seemed intentional, attentive. I stood up to stretch my legs. The movement felt slightly exaggerated, almost like the room responded to me. A shadow shifted. A light flickered subtly, only noticeable in my peripheral vision. I shook my head and laughed quietly. I was alone. It was a normal office. Routine. Nothing strange. I returned to the chair, breathing slowly, letting the quiet wash over me. The room was neutral, professional, unremarkable. But I had the odd, fleeting sensation that the stillness wasn't just silence, it was noticing me, observing, patiently waiting. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I didn't feel scared, just aware. It was only the beginning.
Section 2. Measured Stillness. The door clicked behind me, sealing the small, neutral room in a way that made it feel slightly more private than it should. Not ominous, just complete. I settled back into the chair, smoothing the crease in my trousers, and tried to remind myself that this was routine, the same as any other study I'd participated in before. At first, the room seemed exactly as it had at the start, neutral, quiet, unremarkable. The light above diffused evenly across the pale walls, the chair beneath me perfectly ordinary, the carpet soft but not distracting. I leaned back, feeling the slight spring of the cushion beneath me, and exhaled. The calmness was almost meditative. Minutes passed. I found myself noting the rhythm of my own breathing, the subtle pressure of my feet on the carpet. My thoughts wandered naturally to the mundane, the emails waiting in my inbox, the groceries I'd need to pick up on the way home, the way the office coffee always tasted slightly burnt. Nothing unusual, nothing extraordinary, just a normal, quiet hour. Then I noticed it, a faint sound, so soft that I almost questioned it. A whisper, perhaps, or maybe just the echo of my own thoughts bouncing back in the quiet. I froze for a moment, listening. Nothing. I shook my head, telling myself it was imagination. The room was soundproofed, designed to block the external world. The slightest murmur of the building outside shouldn't be reaching me. Still, there it was again, a fleeting, almost imperceptible repetition of a phrase I hadn't said out loud. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my breathing, counting each exhale. But as I settled back into the chair, it returned, softer this time, almost hesitant. A fragment of a thought I'd barely entertained earlier, the minor worry about forgetting a task at work, was echoed in that quiet murmur. I looked around the room, scanning the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Nothing. No speaker, no device. Just the soft, diffuse light and the ordinary furniture. Yet the sound persisted, subtle, and almost shy, like it was testing my attention. I shifted in the chair. The light above seemed to adjust slightly, though nothing changed visibly. Shadows lengthened in the corners, but only when I let my eyes linger there. The room had not moved, and yet something had. Or perhaps it was me. I tried to stand, stretch, let the tension drain from my legs. The room seemed to react in a way I could not describe. Small, almost imperceptible changes. The hum of fluorescent light softened briefly. A shadow flickered at the edge of my vision. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself I was imagining it. Rationally, I knew I was alone. The room was just a room. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the space was attentive, like water around a stone. Not threatening, just responsive. And curiously, that responsiveness made the whispers clearer. They were no longer just fragments. I heard short phrases, echoes of my own casual thoughts. Did I leave that email unfinished? I shouldn't forget the printer paper. Maybe I'm overthinking this. I hadn't spoken a word aloud, and yet the room seemed to carry my thoughts back to me, a gentle reflection that was both familiar and unsettling. I leaned back again, trying to normalize my reaction. It was probably some side effect of isolation, of sensory deprivation. I reminded myself that psychologists studied perception like this all the time, people's brains misattributing inner thoughts as external sounds,
subtle auditory hallucinations induced by focus and stillness. Logical, normal, safe. And yet, I could not deny the odd rhythm. The room responded to me, slightly brighter when I raised my head, slightly warmer when I exhaled fully, as if the air itself adjusted to my presence. I caught the carpet shifting faintly under my foot, an optical trick, most likely, but it was too convincing to dismiss entirely. I tried a small experiment. I thought deliberately about something neutral, the office plants I passed on the way in, a slight worry about leaving the windows open at home. The whisper echoed the thoughts back, carefully, almost politely. Curious, I tried more. I hope my tie isn't crooked. The room returned the thought, softer, fragmented, like a hesitant voice testing the boundaries of my attention. Time began to stretch. Minutes felt like hours. My peripheral vision caught shadows shifting in ways that weren't exactly natural. They weren't threatening, but they moved with subtle purpose, as though they were adjusting to me, bending to my presence. And yet when I looked directly, everything was normal. I noticed the smell in the room too. Faint, linen and polish, neutral, but it seemed sharper now, more noticeable, almost in tune with me. Not unpleasant, just alerting me to details I normally ignored. My senses felt heightened, stretched. Every heartbeat echoed against the walls. Every small movement registered as a subtle vibration in the air. I realized I was holding my attention differently, more acutely, like a painter observing every brushstroke in a familiar scene. But this time, the scene was myself, my own body, my own mind. The whispers became a companion, small and soft, like someone sitting in the corner repeating my unspoken thoughts in a way I couldn't fully hear, yet I understood. The calm was addictive. The room's neutrality felt safe, almost professional, but its attentiveness was unsettling in its precision. It reminded me of office etiquette, invisible but very present. Someone noticing if I slouched, if I hesitated, if I lingered too long on a thought. Only here, it was the room itself, silently attuned. When the intercom clicked again, signaling the end of the hour, I realized I was reluctant to leave. Not afraid, curious, fascinated, aware. Stepping back into the hallway would return me to the ordinary, predictable world. The office, the researchers, the usual day. And yet part of me wanted to stay in that subtle, reflective quiet where the space responded just to me. I stood, stretched fully, and the light flickered as I did, a detail so slight that it could be anything. But I noticed it, naturally, as I had noticed everything here. I felt oddly observed, yet comforted by the gentleness of it. The room was neutral, professional, normal, and yet, for reasons I couldn't yet articulate, entirely alive. Section 3. Echoes of Thought. When I returned to the room the next day, it felt slightly different, though I wasn't sure why. The walls were the same neutral cream, the chair and table exactly where I remembered, the soft carpet beneath my feet just as ordinary, yet I carried with me the faint memory of the previous session, the whispers, the subtle reactions, the sense that the space had been quietly attentive. I told myself it was nothing, routine study, just another hour of focused observation. I placed my bag on the floor, sat down, and adjusted the chair, letting the familiar silence settle over me. I reminded myself that nothing could harm me. The researchers were professional, the procedures normal. It was an office study, like any other. At first, the quiet was ordinary again. My thoughts wandered to mundane things. I needed to print documents later. I hoped the coffee machine at work had a fresh pot. My shoes were slightly dusty from the sidewalk. Nothing unusual, just a calm hour in an empty room. And then it came, a whisper. This one was different, not a reflection of a thought I had already formed, not the casual internal musings repeated back to me like yesterday. It was a phrase I had barely considered, a fleeting anxiety that hadn't yet surfaced in my conscious mind. You forgot to lock the front door. I froze. My hand hovered over the armrest. The sound was soft, just at the edge of hearing, yet unmistakably a human-like whisper. I hadn't spoken aloud, and yet the room had spoken it back to me. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was an echo from my subconscious, a trick of my own attention. But even as I convinced myself of that, a faint, almost imperceptible tension formed in the room, or perhaps in me. I sat very still, listening. My heartbeat felt louder than usual. The whisper came again, gentler this time, almost coaxing. You should check it. A shiver ran down my spine. Not fear, exactly, more like a sudden awareness of being watched, but not by anyone visible, just present, the room itself. It wasn't hostile, just responsive, attentive, oddly intelligent. I tried a mental experiment. I thought about something completely neutral, the angle of the window at home, the brand of sugar in my kitchen. Nothing. Silence. Then, as soon as my thoughts strayed to a worry I hadn't verbalized, did I leave the kettle on? The whisper returned. The kettle? I couldn't deny it. The room was reflecting my thoughts before I had fully articulated them, feeding them back to me softly, as if testing my awareness. And the oddest part, I didn't feel threatened, only observed, in a way that made me hyper-aware of everything I was thinking, everything I might be about to think. The light above flickered gently as I shifted in the chair. Shadows in the corners moved slightly, though only when I let my eyes linger there. I tried standing, stretching, pacing the small space. The room reacted subtly. The floor seemed to absorb my steps with more softness than before. The air felt heavier when I held my breath. I returned to the chair and rested my hands on my lap, heart still fluttering from the whisper. I reminded myself it was routine. The researchers were calm professionals, the procedures standard. Nothing had changed outside, and yet inside, everything felt different. The room was listening, not to me, but to my attention, my focus, the flicker of my mind. I thought about yesterday, about the hour I had spent in stillness. The whispers then had mirrored my conscious thoughts. Now they were anticipating me, reflecting the edge of my mind. The difference was subtle, but enough to unnerve me slightly. I tried to smile at myself, a nervous, awkward, half smile. This is just a study, nothing unusual, all professional. And yet the whisper returned, not in response to a thought I had formed out loud in my mind, but to one I barely acknowledged. You'll forget something important. I shivered. It was so ordinary, so mundane, just a worry about my day, but it hit me in a way that felt like the room itself had reached inside me, picking up on the smallest fragment of anxiety and returning it to me softly, gently, persistently. I decided to test it further. I thought, I hope my wallet is in my bag. Silence. Then a slight pause. Then the whisper, distant but clear. Check again. I was caught between fascination and unease. There was no threat, no danger, just a neutral professional space reacting in a way I couldn't explain. The room wasn't alive in any traditional sense. It was ordinary, neutral, normal, yet somehow attuned. Time stretched. Minutes flow differently here. The walls seemed closer, but not cramped. Shadows lingered in the corners longer than expected, yet they were normal shadows. The carpet felt softer under my fingers when I rested my hand on it. Each small detail, ordinary, benign, professional, felt like part of an intricate, subtle dialogue. I realized my own awareness had changed. My thoughts were no longer just private mental notes. They had weight. They influenced the room, or at least that seemed that way. I could feel its subtle responses to my attention, its quiet reflection of my unspoken worries. By the end of the session, I was tired, though not physically. Mentally, I felt stretched, hyper-aware of my own thought patterns, attuned to a whisper I could barely hear, but could not ignore. I stood, stretched, and left the room. The hallway beyond seemed louder than usual, the chatter of office staff more vivid. Normality was almost jarring. And yet the whisper lingered in my mind, faint and soft. We'll see each other again. I told myself it was my imagination, a residue of focus, a side effect of attention. Routine study, professional researchers, neutral, ordinary room. Everything was normal. And yet, deep down, I knew that something subtle had shifted. Something was listening.
Section 4. Shifting Attention. I returned to the room the following morning, carrying a notebook this time. Not for anything specific, just to keep my hands busy, to make the experience feel more structured and controlled. From the hallway, the door looked the same, gray, unassuming, professional. But I felt a small, almost imperceptible anticipation, as if the room remembered me. Inside, the quiet settled immediately, familiar and neutral. The chair and table were in their usual places, the light overhead diffused evenly across the walls, shadows soft and predictable. I placed my notebook on the table, took a deep breath, and sat down. At first, the room felt calm, exactly as before. But as I shifted my attention, I began to notice small changes that hadn't seemed significant yesterday. The light above seemed to pulse ever so slightly with my breathing. Shadows at the corners of the room stretched a fraction longer when I leaned forward, retracted when I leaned back. I told myself it was perception, nothing more. The mind is prone to overinterpretation in silence. I tried standing, pacing slowly. With each step, the carpet muffled my movement more than I expected, almost as if it had thickened to accommodate my weight. I stopped in the middle of the room, raising my arms to stretch. The air felt heavier, warmer against my skin. I laughed quietly, shaking my head. Routine experiment, office study, normal. Still, the whispers returned, not repeating my thoughts this time. They seemed to anticipate them. As I considered glancing at the window, a faint murmur echoed, "Look carefully." I hadn't formed the thought out loud. I hadn't even consciously realized I was thinking about it. But the room reflected it back, gentle, coaxing. Curiosity replaced my initial caution. I experimented deliberately, moving in small increments, testing my own attention. Leaning to the left, the light dimmed slightly. Stretching my arms upward, the shadow in the corner lengthened. Tilting my head, a whisper floated in the air, repeating a thought I barely acknowledged. Am I stretching correctly? It was unnerving in a gentle way, not frightening, just intimate. The room felt aware, attuned, responsive, like a colleague who notices every small movement, every subtle hesitation. There was no judgment, no malice, only observation, precise and almost clinical. I began to notice my own body in new ways, every shift of weight,
Every blink, every subtle facial expression seemed amplified. My mind cataloged the responses. Each flicker of light, each shadow adjustment, each whisper became data, a conversation with the room itself, not audible to anyone else, imperceptible to the outside world, but undeniable to me. I tried sitting still, concentrating fully on my breathing. The room responded in tiny, precise ways. The shadows lengthened with my exhale, retracted with my inhale. The whispers followed my thoughts, not the ones I voiced out loud, but the ones I barely considered. Should I have had more coffee? Did I leave the door locked? Was that email clear? Each phrase returned softly, intimate, personalized, almost private. I noticed the effect on my attention. I became more deliberate, more conscious of each action, because the room responded. Small habits like crossing my legs, tapping my fingers, or even holding the pen slightly off the page seemed amplified in consequence. The whispers and subtle changes in shadows and light drew my focus inward, turning my own awareness into a performance, a dialogue with the room itself. At one point, I realized I had been holding my pen mid-air for several seconds, absorbed in observing the shadows stretching along the walls. When I moved my hand, a whisper followed, "Don't drop it." I hadn't spoken, I hadn't thought out loud. Only the faintest hint of worry had flickered through my mind, and yet the room had picked up on it, reflected it back, just enough to make me aware of my own consciousness in a new way. I paced briefly, testing the edges of the room, and noticed the smallest irregularities. The corner of the carpet seemed slightly raised beneath my foot, the angle of a shadow slightly off when I glanced at it out of my corner of my eye. When I focused directly, everything aligned perfectly. The room was precise, neutral, but reactive. My perception of it became layered, a constant feedback loop. I leaned against the table, closing my eyes for a moment, letting the quiet envelop me. I could feel the room's presence, not in sound or sight, but in the way it shaped my awareness. The whispers were gentler now, more patient, almost soothing. Fragments of my own fleeting thoughts, mirrored, emphasized, coaxing me into noticing myself. I began to smile, softly, acknowledging the strangeness of my attention. No one else could hear this, no one else would notice. The researchers would never know. I was alone, and yet the space was active, precise, almost friendly in its attentiveness. It was ordinary in all visible ways, just a routine office experiment, but extraordinary in its subtle intimacy. I thought about leaving, stepping back into the hallway, returning to the usual, predictable office world, and yet the room resisted passively. Shadows lingered just a fraction longer. The light softened in response to my shift of posture. The whispers carried a faint, teasing note. Not yet. I remained seated, curious. Time stretched slowly, each minute lengthening as the room responded to my smallest gestures, my quietest thoughts. The internal awareness and the external space blurred imperceptibly. I was part of the room's rhythm now, a participant in an interaction no one else could perceive. By the end of the session, I was acutely aware of my own attentiveness, the gentle shifts in the room, and the whispers that only I could hear. I left the space feeling both ordinary and strange, as if I had walked through a familiar office, yet stepped into a new dimension of perception. In the hallway, the normal sounds of office life, the tapping keyboards, the faint hum of conversations, the occasional ringing phone, felt almost intrusive, louder than they had any right to be. The ordinary world seemed jarring after an hour of subtle responsivity, and yet the whisper lingered in my mind, soft, patient, intimate. We'll continue. I told myself it was just focus, routine study, normal, professional, nothing unusual. And yet, deep down, I knew the room had begun something it wouldn't let go of.
Section 5. Routine Departure. The intercom clicked softly, signaling the end of the session. I sat in the chair for a moment longer, reluctant to stand, though not from fear. Curiosity and quiet fascination held me in place. The room had been attentive, responsive, almost companionable in a way I could not fully articulate. It wasn't threatening, but leaving felt premature, as though stepping away would break some fragile connection. I stood slowly, stretching my legs, letting my hands rest briefly on the table. The light flickered subtly as I moved. Shadows lingered in corners longer than they should have, yet everything looked ordinary when I focused directly. Still, my attention was sharper than usual. I noticed small details I hadn't before. The slight unevenness in the paint along a corner, the faint scent of polish and fabric softener lingering in the air, the way the carpet absorbed my weight differently depending on my posture. I reminded myself it was a routine study, a professional experiment. Nothing unusual was happening. Researchers had been careful, precise. The procedures were standard. I wasn't being tested in any way beyond attention and awareness. Everything outside the room, the hallway, the other participants, the office beyond, was normal. Still, as I walked toward the door, the whisper came again, gentle, almost coaxing, "You'll come back." I froze mid-step, blinking at the gray surface in front of me. The words were soft, barely audible, and yet unmistakable. I hadn't spoken aloud. I hadn't thought them fully, and yet they were there, present in the quiet space around me. I shook my head, smiling faintly at my own imagination. Routine study, professional, ordinary, unremarkable. Researchers were not trying to unsettle me. This was just focus, attention, perception, nothing more. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The difference was immediate. The muted buzz of computers, the soft murmur of conversation, the faint scent of coffee, all felt louder, sharper, almost intrusive after the quiet attentiveness of the room. I walked calmly, deliberately, back toward the main area, feeling the familiar carpet underfoot, seeing the ordinary walls and desks. It was all mundane, ordinary office life, nothing to hint at the subtle tension that had existed inside that quiet room. I passed a colleague returning from the cafeteria, nodded politely, and continued. My posture was relaxed, my expression neutral. Inside, however, I carried the faint echo of the whispers, the subtle shifts in light, the gentle attentiveness of the space. It was remarkable how small details could persist in the mind once attention had been drawn to them. I found myself quietly cataloging the experience, noticing how ordinary everything seemed from the outside. A simple office, professional researchers, routine study. And yet the internal experience had been anything but ordinary. I paused briefly by the window in the hallway, letting the morning sunlight spill across my face. The world beyond was ordinary. Cars in the parking lot, pedestrians passing the building, office lights turning on and off in the distance. And yet I felt a subtle pull backward toward the quiet room. Not fear, not urgency, just a mild, insistent curiosity. The faint sense that something about that space had shifted inside me, rearranged the edges of my attention in a way I could not easily ignore. I returned to my desk, settling into the routine of the day. Emails, phone calls, the hum of office machinery. Everything normal, everything professional. I smiled at a coworker, answered a question about a spreadsheet, sipped my coffee, and yet between tasks the memory of the room surfaced. The way the shadows shifted, the flicker of light with subtle movements,
the soft, coaxing whisper that repeated thoughts I had barely allowed myself to acknowledge. I reminded myself constantly, this was routine, neutral, professional, nothing unusual. I had left the room safely, returned to the ordinary. It was just perception, attention, focus, nothing more. Even so, the experience lingered. The whispering wasn't alarming, just present in my mind. When I leaned back in my chair, thinking about the day ahead, I could almost hear it, soft, almost shy, like a presence just at the edge of awareness. You'll come back. I told myself it was imagination, a residue of focus, a trace of heightened attention from being in the quiet room. Logical, rational, professional. Nothing to worry about. And yet, by mid-afternoon, I noticed myself checking my watch more often, pacing slightly while thinking through tasks, pausing to glance at the office corridor, as if the room might be there somehow, waiting. The memory of its attentiveness clung to my perception, influencing even my ordinary routines. I began to catalog the experience mentally, the subtle pulsing of the light, the faint shifts in shadows, the whispering responses to my unspoken thoughts. Every small movement I had made seemed significant in hindsight, as if the room had been conducting an invisible conversation with me. No one else would know. The experiment had ended. The researchers were back to normal routines, yet I felt the internal dialogue continuing, faint but undeniable. By the end of the day, I realized I was thinking about the room constantly. Not obsessively, not yet, but enough that my focus had shifted, even slightly, from work tasks to settle memories of the space, its whispers, its attentiveness. Each time I leaned back in my chair, each time I sipped coffee, each time I moved my pen across a page, I felt the faint echo of those subtle interactions, as though the room had left an imprint on my awareness. I left the office that evening, calmly, walking to the parking lot with nothing but ordinary concerns on the surface: groceries, dinner, the drive home. And yet, under the normal rhythms of the world, the whispers lingered, faint, intimate, almost gentle. Will continue. I told myself again, routine, professional, ordinary, normal office study, nothing unusual. And yet the thought persisted. Even outside the building, even in my commute, the quiet attentiveness of that space, the subtle reflections of my own unspoken thoughts, continued to resonate in the background of my awareness. It was only the beginning, though I didn't know it yet. The room had marked my attention. Quietly, professionally, ordinary on the surface, but undeniably alive to me alone. Section 6. I can't stop thinking about it. I didn't plan to go back to the room immediately. I left that day feeling calm, like everything had been routine, normal, professional. But once I stepped outside the building, I noticed something strange. The room had lodged itself in my mind. Not in a scary way, not like a nightmare, more like a quiet, persistent hum, impossible to ignore. At work the next morning, I found myself distracted. I was scanning emails, responding to messages, attending a meeting, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the room. I remembered the way the light shifted when I moved my head, the way the shadows lingered in the corners, the gentle echo of my thoughts in those soft whispers. Nothing alarming, nothing overtly strange, but enough to make my focus wander. I tried to push it away, to return to ordinary tasks. I organized spreadsheets, made notes, answered calls, and yet between these mundane actions, I kept replaying the session in my mind. Each detail seemed sharper than reality. The texture of the carpet beneath my hand, the quiet rhythm of my own breathing, the way the room had felt responsive to me alone. Even at lunch, I found myself sketching the room unconsciously in my notebook. Not diagrams or measurements, just the shape of the space, the way the chair and table were positioned, the angles of the light. I told myself it was normal, harmless, just focus, attention. The researchers had built a controlled environment, nothing extraordinary. And yet that whisper, the one that had anticipated thoughts I barely acknowledged, kept coming back to me in fragments. I didn't hear it aloud, of course, only in my mind, like an internal echo. Check again. You'll come back. Look carefully. I hadn't voiced any of these thoughts, hadn't acted on them, and still they appeared in my awareness, unbidden, familiar, gentle. At night, at home, the pattern continued. I was cooking dinner, folding laundry, brushing my teeth, and still the room followed me in my thoughts. Each small movement reminded me of the attentiveness I had felt there. A flicker of light from the kitchen lamp, a shadow from the countertop, the softness of the carpet under my bare feet, all conjured fragments of the room. I realized I was noticing everything differently now. Ordinary details became signals, echoes, cues to my own attention. Sleep was no different. I dreamed of the room. Not frightening dreams, not nightmares, just quiet, strange repetitions of the space. The chair slightly tilted, the light pulsing, shadows stretching longer than they should, whispers that repeated my unspoken thoughts in soft fragments, just at the edge of perception. I woke in the night, heart steady but mind alert, aware that even in sleep I was rehearsing the room, anticipating its quiet responses. The more I tried to ignore it, the more persistent it became. I started noticing subtle parallels in my day, the rhythm of my commute, the hum of office machinery, the flicker of sunlight through windows. Everything felt like a reflection of that quiet attentiveness. The whispers, although only in my memory, felt alive, persistent, familiar, almost like an unseen companion I couldn't refuse. At work, I found myself drifting during meetings, staring at walls, noticing shadows in corners, the soft light filtering through blinds. It was obsessive, I realized, yet not in a way that caused panic, just a continuous pull, a gentle insistence that my attention return to the room. I sketched it again on scraps of paper, the angles of furniture, the exact hue of the light. It was compulsive, but soothing in a strange way. By the end of the week, I had internalized the experience. The whispers were my own now, part of my thought rhythm. I could recall them instantly, fragments of observations, anticipatory cues, the soft echo of unspoken thoughts. And as the memory of the room strengthened, so did my curiosity. The rational part of me, the professional, ordinary side, reminded me that it was just a study, routine and safe. But another part, quieter and more persistent, kept nudging me, go back, see what happens. Even mundane moments reinforced the obsession. Making coffee, I thought about the faint warmth in the air when I had leaned back in the chair. Walking past a shadow on the office wall, I remembered the subtle stretching of the room's corners in response to my movements. I told myself constantly, this is normal, rational, professional, safe. And yet, the more I tried to dismiss it, the more the details accumulated, layering themselves in my mind, until I could almost feel the quiet attentiveness once again. At home, alone in the evening, I replayed every subtle reaction, the light, the carpet, the whispers. I imagined slight variations. What if I had leaned differently? What if I had focused on another thought? The room's responses seemed alive in memory, precise, deliberate, not threatening, just there. Patiently observing, reflecting, echoing, and I realized, with a small thrill, that it had become a private dialogue, one I could carry anywhere, but no one else could ever perceive. By Saturday morning, I knew I would go back, not because I was afraid or because the room had any obvious power over me. No, because I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every moment, every idle thought seemed to return to the memory of that quiet attentiveness. The whispers, soft and intimate, had settled into my awareness, shaping my perception of everything ordinary. I dressed quickly, making my way back to the research center with the calm certainty of routine. The building looked the same from the outside, gray, neutral, professional. The hallway inside was unchanged, and yet, as I approached the room, a sense of anticipation hummed through me. Not fear, not anxiety, just awareness sharpened to an almost physical edge. The door opened smoothly, as always, and the familiar neutral smell, the soft carpet, the gentle diffuse light greeted me. I stepped inside, carrying the memory of the week with me. The room was unchanged externally, still ordinary, still professional, still calm. And yet it seemed to acknowledge my return. Shadows shifted just slightly. The light softened in a way I could feel in the corner of my vision. And the whispers, they began again, familiar fragments, anticipating thoughts I hadn't even fully formed yet. I realized, sitting down in the chair, that this was no longer just a study. It had become a dialogue, quiet, personal, subtle, a rhythm I couldn't ignore. And I understood, almost with relief, that I would continue this cycle, that I would come back, again and again, because even in the ordinary, professional, normal exterior, the room had touched something in me I couldn't leave behind. Section 7. I went back. I didn't hesitate this time. The thought of returning to the room had become almost irresistible. Not because I feared anything, or because I wanted to test myself exactly, but because every other space, my apartment, my office, even the quiet coffee shop I passed on the way, felt dull in comparison. The room had lodged itself in my awareness, and I needed to experience it again, firsthand, to feel the rhythm of its subtle attentiveness. The building looked ordinary, as always, gray, professional, routine. The hallway leading to the room smelled faintly of the same polish and carpet cleaner. Nothing seemed unusual, yet I felt a small tension in my chest, a curious alertness, anticipation, not anxiety. I opened the door. The room greeted me like an old, silent friend. The neutral walls, the soft carpet, the table and chair in their exact places, all normal. Yet I immediately noticed the small, almost imperceptible details. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch slightly longer than before. The light overhead softened a fraction more, as if acknowledging my presence. I stepped in slowly, deliberately, letting my senses adjust. The whispers began, almost immediately. Familiar fragments of thought returned, soft and coaxing. "You're back. I wondered when you'd return." I hadn't spoken aloud, and yet the voice, or whatever it was, carried in my awareness alone. Gentle, personal, attentive. I sat in the chair and took a deep breath. The quiet was richer than I remembered, almost tangible, wrapping around me like a soft fabric. Shadows moved subtly at the edges of my vision. The carpet felt unusually soft beneath my fingertips. The air seemed slightly warmer. Each small change was ordinary in itself, nothing startling. But together they formed a pattern that made my awareness sharpen, made me feel connected to the room in a way I couldn't explain. I began to move deliberately, testing the boundaries. I shifted slightly in the chair, leaning back, leaning forward. The whispers followed my thoughts, predicting them before I could form them fully. Careful, don't lean too far. Notice the corner. I felt both observed and understood.
like a private conversation happening with a being that existed only for me. Curiosity replaced hesitation. I reached for my notebook, flipping to a blank page, and began sketching the room again. Every detail seemed slightly different from before. The shadow near the corner, the angle of light on the table, the way the carpet seemed to absorb motion. As I drew, I realized the room was subtly changing around me, though nothing appeared altered to anyone else. Objects seemed a fraction shifted, shadows just a hair longer, the atmosphere slightly heavier. I could feel it responding to my attention. I paused and considered standing. The moment my feet left the chair, I felt a small, almost imperceptible shift in the air. The light flickered gently. Shadows shifted in the corners. The whispers followed my thoughts, repeating my unspoken hesitation. Step carefully. Notice the floor. Every movement I made, even the smallest, seemed acknowledged and mirrored by the room. I tried to step back, pacing slowly, testing the space. The room seemed to stretch slightly, subtly, as if to accommodate my movement. The air felt denser, warmer. Shadows elongated, receded, and adjusted, always just at the edge of my perception. Nothing overtly strange, nothing threatening, but undeniably alive in a subtle, precise way. Sitting down again, I realized the whispers had grown more insistent, not aggressive, not frightening, but persistent, following my thoughts more closely, responding to the tiniest flicker of mental hesitation. You're wondering if it's normal. You want to know what happens next. I hadn't thought these words aloud, and yet they floated in my awareness, soft but undeniable. Time began to feel different. Minutes stretched. The ordinary rhythm of the room, the light, shadows, carpet, felt suspended, alive in a way that made my perception acute. I noticed my own heartbeat, my own breathing with a clarity I hadn't before. The room seemed to pulse along with me, shifting imperceptibly, attuned to my presence, echoing my attention. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The light above pulsed with my exhale. Shadows flickered softly in the corners, moving just beyond the edge of my perception. And the whispers continued, gentle, persistent, private. You'll notice more. Pay attention to the corners. Don't miss the subtle changes. I began to feel the compulsion more strongly. Not fear, not obligation, just an irresistible draw, a quiet insistence that I stay, observe, notice, interact. The ordinary world outside the door, the hallway, the researchers, the office beyond, faded in comparison. Inside, I was the sole focus of the space. It was ordinary, professional, neutral to everyone else, but to me, it was alive, attuned, subtle, and intimately responsive. I stood again, pacing slowly, testing my focus. Shadows and light shifted gently with every movement. Whispers mirrored my unspoken thoughts. Are you curious? Do you see it? Notice the floor again. Even the smallest actions, the tiniest gestures, felt amplified in consequence, like a private experiment within an experiment, one I alone could perceive. By the end of the session, I was aware of a strange clarity. My attention was sharper, my senses subtly heightened, my awareness deeply internalized. The room had drawn me back, and I had returned willingly. The whispers, subtle and intimate, had resumed their rhythm, echoing my unspoken thoughts, coaxing me to notice, observe, remain present. As I left the room, I felt no panic, no rush, no fear, only a quiet fascination,
a persistent curiosity that had taken hold. Outside, the world was loud, ordinary, routine. Inside, the room lingered in my mind, whispering softly, patiently, intimately, and I knew with a quiet certainty that I would return. Section 8. It feels different this time. I walked into the room and immediately noticed it. Not in an obvious way, but in that subtle, impossible-to-ignore manner that had become familiar over these past sessions. The walls, the table, the chair, they were the same as ever, neutral, professional, and yet something had changed. The light seemed slightly warmer, though still diffused and calm. Shadows stretched a fraction further in the corners. The carpet, soft as always, felt just a touch more yielding beneath my feet. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but to me it was undeniable. The room was responding, more deliberately than before, to my presence. I sat down, letting the chair absorb me like it always did. The whispers began immediately, soft but sharper than I remembered. Not repeating my thoughts now, but commenting, suggesting, predicting. You'll notice it soon. Look at the left corner. Do you see it move? I hadn't formed any of these thoughts aloud, and yet the room had conjured them, soft and precise, in a way only I could perceive. I moved my pen across the notebook, sketching the table, the chair, the faint shadow in the far corner. Something felt off. The lines didn't quite match my memory. The corner of the carpet seemed slightly lifted. The shadow in the corner. Was it stretching, or was my perception shifting? The room had become a dialogue between what was real and what I imagined. I shifted in my seat, leaning forward slightly. A whisper followed. Not that far. I froze for a moment, staring at the neutral wall. Nothing was visible, nothing moved, yet I knew the room had registered my motion. The subtle changes weren't threatening, but they carried a weight I hadn't experienced before. Time began to feel strange. Minutes stretched longer than they should. A session that had seemed a few moments ago to be normal now felt suspended, elastic. I leaned back, noticing a small shift in the shadows along the wall. They were longer, thinner, almost moving independently, but only at the edge of my vision. When I looked directly, everything was still, neutral, professional, ordinary. I stood and paced slowly. The carpet absorbed my weight with a softness that felt almost responsive. Shadows moved in the corners, stretching and retreating as I approached and stepped away. The whispers tracked my thoughts more closely than ever. You're noticing the light flicker. Check the table edge again. Don't miss the subtle tilt. I realized, sitting again, that the room had begun to distort subtly but persistently. Objects seemed slightly shifted when I looked away, as if realigning themselves just out of my attention. The table was not noticeably different, yet something about its edges felt unfamiliar, unsettlingly familiar at the same time. The shadows, the light, the soft flicker in the corners, they were all in dialogue with me. I traced the outline of the chair in my notebook. The whisper came, softer but precise. A little to the left. My hand trembled slightly as I adjusted the lines. Nothing else had moved physically, but the room's subtle changes created an uncanny rhythm, a private language I alone could perceive. I leaned back again, closing my eyes for a brief moment. The whispers grew more insistent, more patient. You're watching too carefully. Notice the small shifts. My awareness felt stretched thin, hyper-attuned to every micro change, every twitch of light, every subtle shadow flicker, every soft echo of thought became magnified in my perception. I began to question my own perception. Was the carpet really shifting? Were the shadows stretching on their own? Or was my mind stretching to fill in gaps, anticipating change in the familiar pattern of the room? It was unnerving, yet not frightening. The room was neutral, professional, safe, but I could feel it shaping my awareness, guiding my attention in ways I couldn't ignore. I moved to the left side of the room and leaned against the wall, staring at the neutral paint. Shadows seemed to pulse faintly in response to my posture, extending slightly when I exhaled. A whisper, "You're breathing differently." I caught myself adjusting, almost instinctively to align with the room's subtle feedback. The interaction had become so refined, so precise that I felt part of a dialogue I couldn't opt out of. I walked slowly back to the chair, noting another change. The edge of the table seemed to reflect light differently. A shadow shifted where it hadn't been before. I bent down to observe, and the whispers immediately followed my thought. Not too close. I straightened, realizing that every small action was mirrored, anticipated, commented upon by a presence I couldn't see. Only I could perceive it. The awareness became immersive. My mind raced slightly, noticing everything I had not before: the angle of the chair legs, the subtle tilt of the ceiling light, the faint rise of the carpet near the corners. The room was ordinary, neutral, professional, yet undeniably responsive. It was alive, not in the way a person is alive, but in a quiet, precise attentiveness, anticipating and reflecting my smallest thoughts. Time blurred. I had been sitting, moving, observing, sketching, pacing, and yet it felt like hours had passed in what could have been minutes. The whispers tracked me continuously, soft, intimate, and unnervingly accurate. "You're noticing the light flicker. Don't forget the corner. See the shadow shift?" I realized that my attention had become a kind of performance. Every thought, every small movement was echoed, reflected, responded to. The room was ordinary, neutral, professional, but my perception had become intertwined with it. It wasn't threatening, it wasn't malicious, it simply existed, attentive, alive in a subtle, private way. By the end of the session, I was exhausted, not physically, but mentally. My awareness had been stretched thin, focused on the smallest, subtlest cues. I stood slowly, leaving the chair as I had before, stepping to the door with calm precision. Shadows shifted faintly behind me. Light softened as I moved. The whispers lingered in my mind. "We'll see again." Outside, the hallway was unchanged. The world was ordinary, mundane, professional. The researchers went about their routines. Everything external remained normal, but inside, the experience had intensified. The room had escalated, not in drama, not in fear, but in subtle personal insistence. Shadows, light, carpet, whispers, they had become a dialogue, one that only I could perceive, one that had begun to shape my awareness in profound ways. And I knew I would return. Section 9. I can't tell what's real anymore. I stepped into the room and immediately felt it, the sense that this session would be different. Not alarming, not terrifying, just heavier. The neutral walls, the table, the chair, the soft carpet, all familiar, all ordinary. And yet the moment I crossed the threshold, I realized my perception had shifted. I was no longer observing. I was entangled, fully present, fully aware, and completely absorbed. The light above flickered, just slightly, as if testing me. Shadows in the corners stretched further than I remembered, retracting and lengthening in response to my movements. The whispers began immediately, soft, insistent, intimate. "You're back. I wondered when you'd return. Notice everything." I sat down, heart steady but mind alert, aware that my attention was the only thing that mattered to the room. Each movement, each flicker of thought, each shift of posture was mirrored, reflected, coaxed, nudged. I reached for my notebook, flipping to a blank page, but even as I tried to sketch, I felt the room subtly changing around me. The chair seemed slightly lower than I remembered, the table tilted ever so fractionally, the shadow along the far wall just a little longer. None of it was visible to anyone else, neutral, professional, ordinary, but perceptible to me alone. My own awareness had become a tool, a lens, a measuring stick, and the room responded to it. I traced the edges of the table in my sketch. A whisper. "Not exactly there." My hand faltered. I looked up. Nothing had moved, nothing was different, yet the sense of subtle change persisted, impossible to ignore. My focus sharpened, stretching every sense to notice micro changes. The faint pulse of light, the air density around me, the almost imperceptible vibration in the carpet beneath my fingers. I stood slowly, testing the space. Shadows shifted immediately at the edges of my vision, flickering, retracting, stretching in response to my posture. The whispers tracked my unspoken thoughts, gently anticipating. "You're thinking about the corner. Step carefully. Don't miss the subtle pulse." I walked deliberately across the room, feeling the soft carpet absorb each step differently than before. The shadows reacted, elongating, retreating, stretching in rhythm with my pace. The light overhead pulsed faintly, responding to my breath, almost like a heartbeat. I realized then that the room was not simply mirroring me, it was interacting with me, shaping my perception, guiding my attention. I tried to sit again, focusing on the neutral wall in front of me, but the corner caught my eye. The shadow there shifted as I watched. My heartbeat quickened, not from fear, not from panic, but from intensity. I leaned forward slightly, trying to understand. The whisper came softly. "Do you see it move?" I blinked, and for a fraction of a second, the table seemed slightly different. The shadows shifted, the room responded. I couldn't tell if it was real or imagined. Every detail, the light, the shadows, the carpet, even my own posture, felt intertwined. My thoughts were no longer private. My awareness had become part of the room's rhythm, its subtle dialogue, its quiet insistence. I drew in my notebook frantically now, trying to capture the smallest shifts, the faintest movements. The whisper followed my thoughts. "Not fast enough. Look again. Notice the tilt." I realized my attention was the only instrument capable of perceiving these changes. Without focus, the subtle distortions would vanish, leaving only ordinary, neutral, professional space. I paced again, aware that time no longer flowed normally. Minutes stretched endlessly, compressed unpredictably. Shadows flickered at the corners, lengthened and retracted with every subtle motion of my head. The light pulsed in rhythm with my breathing. The whispers became more insistent, more precise, more intimate. "You're holding your pen wrong. Your eyes linger too long. Notice the shadow stretch." I sat down again, heart racing, not from fear, but from the intensity of absolute awareness. I realized that I had become inseparable from the room, my perception entwined with its subtle responses. The ordinary office study, neutral, professional, was transformed into a private dialogue, a private world, and I alone could inhabit it. A soft pulse of light caught my attention. Shadows shifted sharply for a brief instant, faster than anything I had seen before. My mind tried to track it, tried to anticipate, tried to record. The whispers followed my thoughts, precise, patient, intimate. Don't miss it. Pay attention to the corner. You're almost there. I realized then that the distinction between what was real and what was perception had vanished. I couldn't tell if the table had shifted, if the shadows were alive, if the carpet had altered beneath my feet, or if it was all in my mind. And yet I didn't panic. The intensity was overwhelming, yes, but there was a strange, hypnotic calm to it. The room was neutral, professional, ordinary, safe, and yet it demanded my full awareness. I noticed a subtle lift of the carpet edge, shadows flickered again, the light pulsed, my notebook trembled in my hand, and the whispers, soft and intimate, threaded through my thoughts. You see it. Notice it. You understand now. I realized I had reached a point of absolute attention, where every sense, every perception, every thought was entwined with the room. It was ordinary, neutral, professional on the surface, but I alone could perceive the hidden rhythm, the subtle distortions, the soft whispers that reflected my unspoken thoughts. I could feel it in every micro-gesture, every fraction of perception. And then the session ended. The intercom clicked softly. The neutral, ordinary researchers would step in, professional and mundane. But I had experienced something else entirely. I stepped toward the door slowly, deliberately, my mind stretched and sharpened, my awareness lingering on the light, shadows, carpet, and whispers. Outside, the hallway was normal, ordinary, routine. Nothing had changed, but inside me, everything had. I carried the room with me, the whispers, the subtle distortions, the intimate, private dialogue that only I could perceive. I walked calmly, composed, but utterly changed, aware that my attention had been claimed. I knew, with certainty, that I would return. Section 10. I keep thinking about it. I left the room calmly that day. No rush, no panic. Just the ordinary click of the door closing behind me, the soft hum of the hallway, the muted buzz of the office beyond. Everything outside remained mundane, professional, neutral. The researchers moved along their routines, unaware of the private dialogue that had unfolded inside. And yet, inside me, the room lingered. Even walking down the corridor, the faint pulse of light, the subtle stretch of shadows, the soft, coaxing whispers, everything replayed in my mind. They were not loud, not frightening, not even fully audible, just fragments of thought echoing, anticipating, reflecting the tiniest unspoken curiosities I had entertained during the session. I could feel them hovering at the edge of perception, insistent but gentle. We'll see again. Notice the shadows. You'll come back. At my desk, I tried to focus on the ordinary, the routine, the professional. Emails, reports, spreadsheets, phone calls, meetings. Everything felt normal on the surface, but underneath, the memory of the room intruded, quiet but persistent. Shadows in the office corners flickered in my mind's eye. Light on my monitor reminded me of the pulsing overhead lamp. The subtle weight of the carpet beneath my chair echoed the way the experimental room had responded to my movements. Even my thoughts felt different. I caught myself anticipating responses, noticing micro-changes, tracing patterns where there should have been none. The whispers, though absent in sound, followed the rhythm of my awareness, soft reflections of my own unspoken thoughts. Did you leave the door locked? Notice the edge of the table. Are you paying attention? That night in my apartment, the pattern persisted. I tried reading, cooking, even listening to music, but everything reminded me of the room. A shadow stretching across the floor, a faint flicker of light, the soft weight of a chair against the carpet. The memory of the space had embedded itself into my perception, into my attention, into the rhythm of my mind. Sleep did not release me. In dreams the room returned, not overtly altered, not overtly frightening, but subtly different. Shadows lingered longer. Light pulsed in irregular rhythm. Whispers anticipated my thoughts even in the dream, soft and intimate. You're noticing the subtle tilt. Pay attention. I woke, heart steady, but mind alert, aware that my attention had been claimed. I realized then that the obsession was no longer voluntary. I had returned to the room willingly before, but now the memory, the whispers, the subtle attentiveness persisted even in my absence. Ordinary life, the office, the commute, my apartment, had become filtered through this private dialogue. The room was with me, and I was aware of it, constantly, invisibly, privately. I tried to rationalize it. Professional experiment, routine study, neutral, safe, ordinary. Researchers had followed their protocols. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening. And yet, the awareness of the room, the whispers, the subtle changes, the reflections of my unspoken thoughts, these were real. As real as the office walls, as real as the carpet under my feet. Only I could perceive them. Only I had been invited into this dialogue. I found myself sketching again, on scraps of paper, at my desk, at home, in quiet moments. The shadows, the angles, the subtle stretches of space. Each line became a rehearsal, a meditation, a silent acknowledgement of the room's presence. Not frightening, not alarming, just persistent. I could not ignore it. Weeks passed, and the compulsion strengthened. I would glance at the research center on my way home, wondering if I could step inside once more. Not out of fear, not out of desperation, but out of curiosity, fascination, an irresistible need to observe, to participate, to continue the dialogue. And I knew, with certainty, that I would return. Yet even outside, even in ordinary life, the whispers were present in my mind. Gentle, patient, intimate. Notice the corner. We'll continue. Are you paying attention? They were not external, not audible to anyone else, but they were persistent. They shaped my perception, my awareness, my attention. They were alive in the only way that mattered. Private, personal, subtle. I caught myself smiling faintly in public. For no reason. A coworker glanced at me curiously, but I was elsewhere, half in the office, half in the room. Shadows in the corner of the conference room reminded me of the ones that had shifted subtly with my movement in the study. A flicker of light along the hallway wall mirrored the pulsing overhead lamp. The world had become a reflection of that quiet attentiveness. I thought about the next session, though it had not yet been scheduled. I imagined stepping through the door, familiar smells, neutral walls, soft carpet, shadows stretching and retracting in response to my movement, the whispers, soft and patient, predicting and reflecting my thoughts before I could form them fully. The room had marked my awareness. It had become a private dialogue, and I realized I would always carry it with me. Even now, writing this down in quiet reflection, I can feel the edge of it. The room exists in memory, in attention, in the subtle awareness that has taken root inside me. Not frightening, not hostile, just alive, attentive, private, only mine. And I know I will return.